Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Future of Urban AI lecture series. This is a jointly organized series between Paris-based Urban AI and Cornell Tech in New York City. This is the third event on the Quantified Canopy. I am your host, Anthony Townsend. I'm with the Urban Tech Hub at Cornell Tech, and Hubert Biroche from Urban AI is also with us. Before we begin, I just wanted to go over two logistical things that may be of interest. First of all, let's see. This is the calendar for the rest of the series. We're here on October 11th. Got some great events coming up. And the way the registration works, if you want to be notified, I do believe we're using the same Zoom link for every event. Is that correct? So you can keep coming back to the same spot, and we will be here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Central European Time. But you can also register for the events individually on Eventbrite, and we'll share the link to that in the chat. The other thing I wanted to share with you was to kind of pull the curtain back a little bit on how this whole series evolved and how we identified the topics that we're covering. If you recall, I talked about the future of urban tech, which was this attempt to sort of pry open the future of urban technology that we published last year at the Urban Tech Hub at Cornell. And it's really, I think of it as like a Wikipedia of the future of urban tech. It's a graph that has several different layers of synthesis, from high-level forecasts down to driving trends and the actual signals of discoveries and innovations we're seeing around the world that influenced these narratives. But there's a what I think of as like the power user tool, which we call the Horizon Scan Explorer, which if you go to the menu in the upper right-hand corner, pull the hamburger down, view the Horizon Scan Explorer, you can slice and dice this graph however you want. And so when Hubert and I started planning this series, we wanted to pull out this slice across the entire network of information that was relevant to AI. So we started doing things like selecting computer vision. What else do we have down in here? We have a deep learning tag somewhere down in here. Here we go, predictive analytics. And if you click match all selections, it will only highlight the nodes that fulfill all these, that have all these tags, or you can select the ones that have either tag. And so what we did was really just extract out the parts of the forecast that were really linked tightly to developments in AI. So our speaker today is not yet included in the forecast, but it's because the research is so cutting edge that we hadn't had a chance to catch up yet. And so, but we do have a lot of stuff in the forecast about trees as infrastructure, because this is something that has been really coming to the forefront of urban planning over the last few years as we start to realize all the benefits of trees. And our guest is Sara Beery. Sara is going to join MIT as an assistant professor in the Faculty of Artificial Intelligence and Decision Making in September 2023. Sara received her PhD in computing and mathematical sciences at Caltech in 2022, where she was advised by Pietro Perona. Her research focuses on building computer vision methods that enable global scale environmental and biodiversity monitoring across data modalities, tackling real-world challenges, including strong spatiotemporal correlations, imperfect data quality, fine-grained categories, and long-tailed distributions. She partners with non-governmental organizations and government agencies to deploy her methods in the wild worldwide and works towards increasing the diversity and accessibility of academic research in AI through interdisciplinary capacity building and education. Sara is joining us today from Nairobi, Kenya. And with any luck, we'll have a reliable Wi-Fi connection throughout. So Sara, take it away.
Thank you so much. And yeah, everyone, please be patient with my Wi-Fi. And Anthony has agreed to tell me if it gets so bad that I should turn my screen or my video off, but I think it's nice to be able to see speakers. So I'm gonna try it and see how it goes. Let me share my screen really quick. Cool. Yeah, so as that's loading up, today I'm planning to mostly talk about ways that we can think about mapping the urban forest, specifically from the perspective of trying to capture as much information as we can from the different modalities of data that already exist, you know, and then thinking about, you know, where is the value of data from these different modalities, and whether there's sort of shared benefit, or possibly you can even start to see better performance in perhaps cities that you didn't see during training by trying to actually bridge the gap between data modalities and see if they can enforce each other, give you extra information one way or another. But first, you know, just as a brief high-level overview, I wanted to talk about some of the different benefits of the urban forest. One that is very near and dear to my heart, as a lot of the work that I've done so far has been around biodiversity in wildlife, is how much urban ecosystems and urban forests actually maintain and support regional biodiversity. And this is where actually the species of trees really comes into play, because different species of trees actually provide different types of habitat for different types of species. So it goes far beyond just the biodiversity of the trees themselves. It also plays a strong role in the biodiversity of the other species in your city. Trees have been shown to reduce air pollution, they sequester carbon, and they also help reduce energy use. One of the main ways that they do that is they provide shade, which helps reduce the amount of cooling you need to do inside buildings. And that also brings us to how they are one of the main ways to mitigate extreme heat islands. As we're seeing with climate change, unfortunately, extreme heat islands are going to be a larger and larger factor, and people have already died. And so, you know, being able to actually try to reduce surface temperature by targeted planting of trees and trying to basically increase access to the type of benefits that trees provide is very important. Beyond just reducing temperature, it's also been shown to affect both physical and mental health for the humans living in cities. And with more than 4 billion humans living in cities worldwide, this is like clearly something that we all care about and should care about more. But I think one of the things that I wanted to emphasize here, as my images very slowly load, we'll see how this goes, guys, is that these benefits are not universally accessible. So what you're looking at here is the difference from the air between Pasadena and Carson, both part of the sort of greater Los Angeles area. Pasadena, where Caltech is located, which is where I did my PhD, is a very, very green part of the city. It's also an incredibly wealthy and not super racially diverse area. Carson is not wealthy and is very racially diverse and has much, much less access to urban greenery. And one organization that's actually been, that I think very highly of, that's been explicitly trying to target and understand and surface this information about the equity of access to trees is this organization called Tree Equity Score. If you haven't checked them out, you totally should. But they provide, essentially based on an aerial tree canopy map, just a rough sense of the equity of access to trees across many different cities worldwide. And, you know, one of the things that I think is a big factor in trying to reduce some of that inequity is we need to know how to best allocate resources from an urban planning perspective so that we can target equity and access to green space, and also beyond that, actually explicitly try to target maximal, like local biodiversity, for example. But unfortunately, access to information about where and what trees already exist in cities is not universally there. Tree inventories, doing this manually, going around and locating individual trees and categorizing them to species is something that tends to be highly expensive. A single sort of traditional census can take years to complete and cost up to $5 million. And this means that actually just access to this type of information becomes inequitable at the city level. Cities like Los Angeles are able to do these censuses somewhat periodically, but many cities have never completed an urban tree census. Because they're so expensive, they tend to be very out of date. The most recent information could be 5-10 years ago. And they tend to be limited in scope, only maybe covering certain parts of the city. So what we've been trying to do in this larger project that I kicked off at Google a couple years ago now, or maybe about a year ago, is we're trying to figure out if we can try to automate this urban forest monitoring. We can automate finding and categorizing all the sort of public trees and maybe even the private trees in cities. And this is an extension of an existing project at Google that does tree canopy prediction. This is just a demo of that in Los Angeles. It's through the Google Urban Ecology Team. And this actually now is, Google's now partnering with Tree Equity Score. So these models from Google, which have been shown to be a bit more reliable than the models they already had access to, are now going to be surfaced through Tree Equity Score, which is, I think, really exciting. And I think is an example of one of the ways that, you can work within industry, but actually partner with NGOs, partner with groups that are doing that on the ground collaboration with stakeholders that really understand all the human dimensions and try to make sure that you're kind of being the best of both worlds, as opposed to Google trying to sort of be its own version of an already existing and pretty awesome group. But tree canopy prediction alone is sort of insufficient. It's great for like a high pass. We think there's about this many trees in this part of your city versus here. But what cities need to know is where are the trees that they are responsible for. So, public trees, which are usually trees between the street and the sidewalk, and what species are they? And knowing what species they are, even what genus they are, is really, really important when you're trying to do future prediction, because we have reasonable understanding of how different species of trees grow and the types of ecosystem services they provide, though I think there's a ton of room for expanding our understanding in those spaces. So if you know the species of trees, then you can start moving into better, more accurate estimation of potentially water retention during areas of flooding, predicted future carbon sequestration, estimating that heat reduction, because that actually also is quite species specific. A palm tree provides a lot less heat reduction than something with a large amount of leaf cover. And then it also enables us to start monitoring species level reaction and resilience to our changing climate. Currently, the estimates say that the trees that are sort of currently exist in, let's say, New York City, that probably the city trees are going to need to shift to be more like the trees that you see in South Carolina within, the next 50 years. So we're basically like shifting like where certain trees are able to live naturally and without a ton of intervention. And so when you're thinking about targeting future planting, you really want to plant for the future, not for now. And then we can also try to strategically plan planting to maximize biodiversity and to make sure that you're maintaining these connectivity and these corridors for migration for different species. So, we're not the first people to think of trying to use computer vision to find and categorize individual trees. There was actually some prior work in the lab I came from at Caltech, Pietro Perona's lab, where they showed that they could get reasonably accurate predictions of trees in Pasadena using a lot of expert-generated labels, street view images, aerial images, as well as map data. And they have a few really nice papers about how this was done. But the problem was these models really only worked for the most common species. They targeted around 40 common species. And more insidiously, they didn't work anywhere else. And this kind of falls into the trap of what we're now realizing are one of the largest bottlenecks to scalable, reliable computer vision and machine learning based solutions for environmental science. is this concept of global generalization. You can get a model that works in one place, like Pasadena. That model is not necessarily guaranteed to work even in the greater Los Angeles area, because there are these very strong spatiotemporal correlations and even shifts in distribution that you see across cities that cause machine learning models to start to really fall off in performance and reliability. And so what we want to do is figure out, how do we scale to more cities with minimal additional labeling? What are the ways that we can start analyzing and figuring out how do you build reliable models that can be used sort of equitably across the scope of many cities, instead of only in cities where you necessarily have access to expert labeled training data to help you train a species identifier. And so as like a first step on this path, we built a very large scale data set we're calling the Auto Arborist data set. It was published this year at CVPR. And this data set is mostly focused just on North America, but it covers 23 different cities, around 344 genera of trees, and has 2.6 million tree records in a standardized format, standardized taxonomy, as well as over 1 million trees with associated imagery. And this is by far the largest urban tree data set that had been released in the past. And what you are kind of seeing here is sort of the distribution of these cities that we're studying with this data set. And we tried to sort of spread it out and try to understand some of these like geospatial similarities. Let us really start to think about in a very data-driven way, how reliable models might be, and are there ways for us to understand with minimal additional human intervention or human labeling, what our uncertainties might be in a new city. And so this data set is kind of a nice example of a computer vision data set that is really built from a known and existing problem. And so instead of being highly curated and maybe like artificially balanced, the data set is long-tailed, which means that there's just like 25 species, or actually genera of trees in this case, that are very, very frequent. Note the log scale here. And then there's, another sort of set of genera that are common. And then there's this whole long tail where in these cases, in both training and test, the genera of trees are seen very rarely. And this is something that's really challenging for machine learning models. They tend to be very data hungry. So the more frequently you've seen a genera of tree, the more likely you are to be able to recognize it in the future. We also have this, hierarchical structure that's captured here, where you can actually see this is the taxonomy of those different genera of trees. And you can see that that natural taxonomy, it's non-uniform, but it might actually be quite useful. And so potentially you can actually capture some of that structure in the domain and use it to help you identify these species of trees that are more rare. Each tree record that has associated imagery comes with sort of paired aerial and street view data. And this is nice because it enables you to start studying kind of these different modalities of data that are already being captured and understanding the value or sort of the benefit given to us by each of these. Notably, I think aerial data is widely accessible. This is pretty high resolution. It's about, I think it's 30 centimeter resolution data in most cases. There's, I think, 1 or 2 cities that are at a lower resolution. But 30 centimeter resolution data that's captured, periodically, but covers every tree in a city, really has like some amounts of sort of spatial and maybe even temporal value that you don't necessarily get from street level imagery, but that street level imagery gives you a much richer view of the trees. And so you can also see here something that I think is really important as anytime you're working in an urban ecosystem, is that for this street level data, we've like purposefully and with a human verification blurred out pixels that are not roads, sky, or trees. And this is because there's a lot of actually quite personally identifiable information that's visible from the street. And so I think we all need to think really carefully about ways to try to do urban AI, but in a way that tries to preserve privacy for the citizens of the city. What we can show is sort of the benefit of curating these large scale data sets is that, kind of intuitively, you can see that as you're increasing the amount and the diversity of your training data, that models trained on that full data set do tend to outperform city-specific or region-specific models. So that's like, West Coast, Central, and East. But it's not always true. So interestingly enough, for Calgary, for example, the regional model performs slightly better than that global model. And this is something that we're really excited to continue to dig into. Just try to really understand the nuance of when and how and what the factors are in this generalization, so we can try to start releasing these models at scale in a way that's safe. You don't want people to start making policy decisions based on a biased machine learning model that tends to kind of take you down the wrong direction. And I think it's interesting to think about how we can actually figure out how to deal with machine learning uncertainty as we're thinking about policy. One of the things that is a big factor in that generalization are these distribution shifts across cities. And these are, sometimes this is termed domain shift, and there's different ways that you can think about that shift. One of them, a really obvious one, is just a shift in the frequency of different genera of trees. So this is like the 10 most common genera across the whole data set. And if you just look at sort of those shifts in color across the different cities, you can see that there is like a pretty notable shift between these different cities in terms of what is frequently seen. And the other sort of dimension of shift is visual shift. And that's because different environmental factors affect the ways that trees grow. So these trees can actually look a bit different for different cities. Oh, I think I lost you guys for a second. Can you still hear me?
We haven't lost you, so it's all good.
Great. Okay. I turned off my video just in case.
Turn the
You
video
all
off.
froze, which made me nervous. Cool. So, and then here, this is actually looking at that in a more quantifiable way. So here, what we're showing is, those 23 cities, as well as the regional models here. These are the training sets. Here, you're looking at the test sets. And what we've done is we've done a pairwise analysis of if you train a model to recognize trees in one city and then test it on another city, what's the performance look like? And here, darker is better and lighter is sort of worse in a way. Or no, over here. So this is the distance between the distributions on the left. So this is actually looking at if you just normalize the distribution over the species of trees that are seen in any given city, what does that look like? You'll note that the diagonal is not perfectly dark, and that's because we've split up the data regionally within each city to make sure that we're not overfitting. What we did find is if you randomly sample from the data within train and test across the city, you get a massive amount of overfitting, where if you have examples from the same street, they're very likely to be the same species of tree. And so you kind of get this fake sense of how good your model is performing. But using a spatial split, we get a more realistic estimate. And here you can see that there's kind of these geospatial blocks that are forming. And that those are actually mimicked in the accuracy. So now here on the right, you're looking at the street level accuracy. So looking at only street level data, how do we perform between train and test? And I think this is really interesting, and it kind of gives us a sense of, as we continue to expand, one thing we might want to look into is if we can predict whether we think we might be able to perform well on a given city based on the training data we have, and how to think about explicitly curating the right additional training data to start maximizing performance on cities that haven't been seen during training. And then, digging a little bit more into that generalization here, sorry, this is like really lagging. That plot doesn't look like it wants to load, but the takeaway from this plot is that essentially it's not necessarily just volume of data that makes something generalize well. So if you have a city like Los Angeles, what we see is that though the city itself has lots of examples of trees, I think there's around 300,000 training trees in Los Angeles in our data set, they all tend to be sort of very spatially similar to LA, like there are lots of palm trees, for example. And this means that actually Los Angeles generalizes much worse across the board to other cities in the data set. Whereas if you train on New York, a similar number of training trees, but a lot more diversity of what's seen, we actually see much better generalization performance. There's the plot. Cool. So here's Los Angeles here. You can see this is sort of the distribution of its performance on these different test cities. The red is the performance of it on itself. And you can see that Los Angeles generalizes quite bad, even though it has, quite a few trees, whereas New York generalizes really well. And Columbus, Ohio only has 94,000 training trees and is still sort of generalizing better than LA. So I think that's quite interesting. And again, just more dimensions of how we can continue to probe and analyze these models to understand how we can scale them up, how we can move to, doing this for every city in North America, eventually every city on Earth, and in a way that we understand and can continually verify that performance and do quality control. And then the last thing I wanted to point out is that actually combining information across that street level and aerial view does improve performance. But the first thing that's important to note here is that predicting tree species from aerial data only is very difficult. The performance is pretty consistently terrible. And the thing I want to point out here, this is average recall across sort of averaged across all these different genera of trees. And so while these numbers look quite low, it's really quite heavily influenced by the fact that these models really struggle to recognize very rare species. And if you look in the paper, we have a lot of breakdowns of the performance by, the different sort of commonalities, so frequent, common, rare. And we're able to predict the frequent species quite accurately, even in cities that aren't seen during training. So the models are sort of good enough where we can start to actually potentially use them, and we are looking at that. But the important thing to note here is that aerial data, it is very hard to recognize the species of trees. And a lot of people have been trying to do this for a long time from aerial data alone. There's been a ton of amazing research in this space. But I think it's important to note that street level or ground level information is just explicitly more valuable here in a way. And having multiple views of that street level data, again, increases performance. But the aerial data is not, useless. It definitely can contribute. And the way we incorporated it here was like pretty naive. We were really just doing like a mixture of experts based model where you decided sort of how to incorporate aerial and street level votes in a way. And the interesting thing, so looking at down here at the bottom, what we found is the best is if we used like a regional mixture of experts. So actually you let each region have its own weights over the category set for how much it was going to incorporate that or trust that aerial information. And you can see that there are sort of some trees, let's say here, where the weight of that information from an aerial side is nearly half. And, there's maybe really like quite a few, there's less like frequent counts of them. And so this to me, like these trees kind of represent examples of genera where the aerial information is more valuable. And it kind of makes that sense. Things like very tall palm trees where the street level data might only see a long, stick. And from the air, you actually see that structure of the top of the palm. And it gives you that information that you need to be able to identify the genus. Certain types of pine trees and things like these cypress trees. Now, so currently what we're digging into is trying to do better instancing across views. So not sort of just naively ensembling and saying like, hey, here are a bunch of pictures that are looking at the tree we're interested in. We actually want to explicitly match the different instances of these trees across the different street level views that we have and with the aerial view. And we're currently doing that by incorporating LiDAR, which is available from street level data, and trying to understand how much that LiDAR versus some very, very simple pose-based models benefits. We're also trying to dig into some of that geographic and temporal context and see if we can actually give the models that information and whether that will help improve our generalization and our understanding. And then one of the things I think is quite interesting is we're looking at self-supervision across modalities. So, if you have these multiple views from the ground or from the air, can you actually use agreement across those modalities as training signal to build a feature representation that actually generalizes better? And then looking at things like multi-label loss to handle the fact that often there are trees that are unlabeled in people's yards in the background of these images, as well as loss balancing to try to tackle some of that long tail. The dataset has been publicly released. You do need to sign terms and conditions form in order to have access to it, because we have to basically enforce that if anyone requests that one of these street view images are taken down, which is a valid thing because, again, of personally identifiable information, then you must agree to also remove it from your copy of the dataset. But you can check out the dataset, read more about it, and yeah, let us know if you have any questions or any thoughts about how we can continue to expand it and go forward from here. Sort of more broadly, just as a last little plug at the end, I work a lot kind of in this intersection between computer vision and ecology, you know, beyond just urban ecology, but I think urban ecology is fascinating. These questions about global and local domain shift are universal. They show up in wildlife ecology across modalities. They show up in, you know, I think almost any deployed real world machine learning problem. And there's quite a cool data set called Wilds that actually explicitly looks at how these types of global and local domain shift are really playing a big role in the usability of machine learning. But there's a huge amount of effort around long-tailed distributions. The real world is very long-tailed. The data, you know, sparse, low quality, multimodal. We really have a need for more sort of interactive ecologist AI systems. So, you know, building things where even if the model's not perfect, it still can save a stakeholder time. You know, maybe you provide the city with an inaccurate map of trees that you know is inaccurate, but you can tell them where to prioritize their effort to reduce that uncertainty. And then providing access to technology equitably and building up interdisciplinary capacity. So trying to make some of these machine learning, computer vision skills accessible to people in other fields so that they can use them to solve their own problems. I run a Slack channel called AI for Conservation. It's got around 1,000 global researchers who work in this space. So if you're interested, you can just email that email and join our Slack. There's quite a few people there who work on trees in the city and in the wilderness. And I also have been running this summer school on computer vision methods for ecology explicitly around that capacity building space. So here, this is actually a school where we bring in ecologists, environmental scientists who are senior researchers, maybe finishing their PhD, doing a postdoc, starting a faculty job, or working for NGOs. And we train them for 3 weeks to build their own computer vision models for their own data. And so if you think you would like to learn computer vision in a pretty hardcore, like slap it together fast course, but you know, everyone does actually walk out with their own code and their own models and their own understanding of how to evaluate those models, please apply. The application just actually went out. So we're accepting applicants for next year. And these are some examples of the projects from this year. And one that I think might be interesting to all of you is there was an entire project around categorizing urban wildlife in camera traps. And then there was another one looking at 3D modeling and predicting wind speeds from videos of swaying trees to try to, for future sort of potential like fire identification. Awesome. Okay, that's all. Thanks for letting me do a plug at the end for my ecology stuff. And I'm super happy to discuss with all of you.
Thank you, Sarah, so much for sharing this research. It's fascinating. I thought what I'd do is start out with a couple maybe technical questions just to clarify some of the things that you talked about. Alex had a question in the chat. Do you ever use temporal range imagery, same tree at different times of the year, to improve species identification due to leaf color, canopy fullness changes through the seasons?
Yeah, so we're actively looking into this. One of the things that is just empirically true is that it is much harder to identify species of trees in the winter, particularly the further north you go. So trees without leaves become harder and harder to identify. And so there's one factor of this where you actually just try to explicitly target street view or aerial images during times of the year when there are leaves on trees. But I think there's actually a lot of signal in the time when leaves drop trees or trees drop leaves, sort of the timing of that. One of the things we've been thinking about is, okay, some of the trees, you have this ground level imagery, but there's lots of trees in cities where you don't, but they all have some sort of shared environmental factors. And so if you get sort of a satellite image of a bunch of trees from the air, and you can reduce your uncertainty about the species of some of those trees because you have street level views. And then there's this visual similarity based on sort of when these trees are sort of dropping leaves or changing color, that you could then propagate that uncertainty effectively to trees that are not visible from the street. But this is still we're still exploring this for sure. The other thing that's interesting from just increasing your sort of multimodality perspective is sort of the higher resolution images you have, the better from an aerial perspective. That's something that's definitely been shown, at least on tree species ID in the wilderness. But usually that much higher resolution aerial data is then taken from low-flying aircraft, which means it's, again, the temporal dimension of it is much, much more limited. Whereas we have low resolution data very, very frequently in time. And so then there's this other, dimension of, okay, well, can you map that temporal change from the low resolution data and then bring in the high resolution data from the air, and then also bring in the street level data from Google Street View, and then bring in, iNaturalist images of trees, which we also have localization for, and try to bring all these data modalities together to build sort of a more reliable map.
So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about why the sort of more geographically focused models, like for an individual city or a region, actually do worse than the training on all of the data. Like for a layperson, that's kind of counterintuitive. I'm curious whether it was a surprise for you and what.
Yeah. So okay. So essentially, I think it's kind of this trade-off, and this is just my opinion. I think it's this trade-off between the diversity and the volume of data that you get when you expand to more cities, and the kind of usefulness of that diverse data in your specific city. So if you just train on one city, then you only have X number of examples per genus of tree. You expand, and as you grow, particularly for those common and even those rare species, you're starting to see more and more examples. So you're able to sort of train your model more effectively to recognize what that tree might look like. But then you also have this added factor of sometimes that tree looks different somewhere else, and it might actually be confusing the model. So this type of question, this trade-off between generality and specificity in machine learning models, and how do you really build, given sort of all the data we have, project optimal or city optimal or user optimal models, I think is a much broader question in machine learning, and one that's pretty understudied.
So there was another set of questions around sort of, I think in the beginning you proposed this as like a potential alternative or replacement to manual tree censuses. In addition to species identification, we talked about saving money. Trunk diameter, condition of the tree, height, these are other kinds of data that get collected. Yeah. Are those things that could potentially be pulled out of the methods that you're using to supplement or replace those?
Great question. I'm currently in the process of trying to get a sense for how accurately from that Street View LiDAR we might be able to estimate DBH. One of the things I keep trying to pin down from urban ecologists is how accurate does DBH need to be valuable? And I think the other thing that people are really interested in is sort of not just...
What's DBH?
Diameter at breast height.
Oh, okay.
Just sorry, I'm using jargon, but yeah, that's jargon that I learned recently. So maybe I'm just using it because I'm proud I learned it.
No, you're ahead of us.
But so I think some of the things people are very interested in also is just change over time. Mm-hmm. So, being able to get more sort of, maybe these maps only get updated, when Google Street View drives another route. But potentially that's still going to give you much more temporal dimension just in terms of tree death than what's previously been possible. I think there's a huge role to play here for community science driven monitoring. And I think what's interesting is trying to figure out how to kind of bring all these different pieces of the puzzle together. Like maybe you can build like a rough estimate of sort of the entire city's trees using these automated methods. And then you provide that map to the city along with an uncertainty. And then community scientists can actually go out and target and either correct or confirm the identities of trees that the model's not certain about. So sort of targeting the human effort to be efficient, I think could be a really cool way to kind of bridge the gap here. And also, targeting even the censusing effort, thinking about building these tree censuses reliably, sort of starting from AI and then having, one of these consulting companies then just do sort of enough verification or quality control that you understand sort of the certainty of those maps and how to then bring those into like further downstream ecological models. I think health, and you mentioned health and height. Height is tricky without something. I mean, I think there's been some cool studies doing height from aerial LiDAR. I think that maybe makes more sense as a modality. You can't always see the top of the trees from Google Street View, and just from like a RGB based aerial data, I think there have been studies looking at height, but I think it's possible. It's not something that we actually have in our data to be able to actually analyze our ability to do that. We do, some of those cities, we do have diameter of breast height, but again, they're often like 5 years out of date or 10 years out of date. And then health, I think, is a really interesting one, particularly around like tree maintenance and liability and like sort of human protection. And it would be quite cool, actually, if we could start trying to model these trees in 3D. I just saw that Naomi said that citizens can't determine condition. And I think this is actually another really interesting dimension as you move into these like real world spaces, is like human expertise and like what can a community scientist do reliably versus what can't they do. So what we've found with wildlife, at least, is humans are really good at drawing boxes around animals. So they can definitely do sort of quality control around like detecting and finding animals. But identifying to species, community scientists are very bad at, even with a lot of training. And so, trying to figure out how you combine the two, like maybe the community scientists can help you determine whether you're missing trees, and then you'd be able to target to experts the actual identity of the species of trees, for example.
It's fascinating to me because this seems to be sort of like, how these AI methods are really playing out in many, many different fields. Is like, let's just get all the routine stuff out of the way so that human beings can focus on like the judgment calls, basically.
Yeah.
And we bring the experts into play there. I also had a question about frequency. Like, a lot of these tree censuses, as you noted, are done every 5 years or 10 years. Is this potentially opening the door to much higher frequency tracking of the health and status of the urban forest?
I think so. But again, you're sort of, it's like, this is an example of like trying to piggyback environmental monitoring on top of some sort of like existing commercial infrastructure. So I don't know that we would be able to, send out Street View cars explicitly for tree censusing. Who knows, maybe one day, but you definitely could try to update your maps every time they did drive those routes. I think this is one of the dimensions where equity also comes into play. New York City has Street View routes driven almost every year. Many cities in the US, they're more like every 5 years. But this is where maybe that aerial data, like, that is actually maybe a space where the aerial temporal frequency, we can start studying, like whether we can use the street level data to help improve those maps and then study the change over time from just the aerial. I think lots of open questions here.
So one final question from Alex Cobald, who is leading some work at Cornell Tech that's using this LiDAR data to develop 3D models of trees. And Alex wants to know, like, what value would you see in adding 3D information describing each tree to your current work?
Yeah, so I was talking to a couple tree experts on this, and I'm sure that other people have other opinions. I don't think the 3D information is going to be as helpful in terms of identifying the species, but I think 3D information could be quite cool in terms of tracking some of these metrics and things like structural integrity. But I think it's really yet to be seen how valid of a monitoring sort of modality that is, whether you can, from a LiDAR scan alone, sort of get a fine-grained enough picture to understand how that tree is changing over time and model it well. Trees are also an example of like something that's just really difficult for LiDAR because of the way that leaves are. So, like whether that thing bounces off of a leaf or goes through the tree, or, the permeability or lack of permeability of those and during different times of year can make them just really difficult to build 3D models of from just like simple LiDAR scans. The trunk is at least a bit more stable. So maybe we can model, trunk and get the width, but the branches and stuff might be more difficult. Thanks, Naomi. I'm glad I got that right.
Thank you, Sara, for your time. We know you're busy traveling, and this is fascinating. The video has been recorded. We'll be putting it up on the Urban AI YouTube channel. Hubert, do you want to say anything about next week's event before we finish?
Oh, well, first, thanks a lot, really, Sara, for the presentation. It was really fascinating. Next week event, it will not be with Ariel Neumann. This one, it will be in 2 weeks. Let me check very quickly. Sorry for this. Yeah, no, actually, it will be with Ariel Neumann. So next week, we'll have the great pleasure to welcome Ariel Neumann from the MIT Media Lab, and we are going to talk about Cityscope, really a fascinating project. So if you want to register, you have a link in comments.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sara. And we will see you next week.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.